Hello, everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because, honestly, we're unpacking a topic that feels like it's been ripped straight out of a political spy thriller, except it is very, very real. We're going to look into the deeply complex, often hidden forces driving these tit-for-tat oil tanker seizures we've been seeing out on the high seas. And I promise you, right up front, we are looking at this strictly through an analytical lens. No political side-taking here. We're just going to follow the data, the history, and international law to figure out what is really driving this global standoff. Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp what's happening, we need to zoom way out from the immediate maritime conflicts and analyze historical imperialism right alongside modern neocolonialism. Here is our agenda. We'll start with seizing oil, defense or abuse. Then we'll cover sanctions and economic warfare, the roots of oil imperialism, neocolonialism and economic control, and finally, masking hegemony with culture. Let's get to it.
Section 1. Seizing oil. Defense or abuse? So recently, we've seen this dramatic escalation in the seizure of merchant oil tankers, mostly involving the United States and Iran. Ships are intercepted, cargo gets confiscated, and the high seas are basically turning into an active, albeit undeclared, conflict zone. It forces us to ask a really direct question. Is seizing another nation's oil a legitimate act of defense, or is it a flat-out abuse of power? Well, as you'll see, the answer you get depends entirely on the geopolitical and legal framework you're looking through.
Now, one side frames these seizures strictly as defense. The United States and its allies argue that seizing Iranian oil is an absolutely critical measure to choke off counterterrorism financing, specifically funds tied to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They see it as enforcing nonproliferation and maintaining maritime security. But conversely, international legal scholars and Iranian authorities present a powerful counterargument: abuse of power. They assert the U.S. is aggressively taking its own domestic sanctions and applying them extraterritorially. That's a huge violation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is supposed to guarantee freedom of navigation. So the crucial point is this major clash between enforcing domestic sanctions and upholding international maritime law. Section 2. Sanctions and economic warfare. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we transition from physical ships to invisible digital networks. Global economic infrastructures that we used to think of as perfectly neutral platforms for collaboration, they've been completely transformed into tools of soft war. When a dominant state restricts access to these digital financial systems, they can effectively cut an entire nation off from global trade. And keep in mind, while it's called soft war, the impact is incredibly hard on civilians. It triggers massive inflation and capital flight, meaning everyday people suddenly can't afford basic necessities. Academics actually have a term for this: weaponized interdependence. It happens when powerful states leverage their dominant position inside key global infrastructures, think the SWIFT banking system or dollar-clearing networks, to enforce totally crippling sanctions against their adversaries. This is exactly how modern Western hegemony enforces its will without ever dropping a bomb or firing a single kinetic shot. It's a real game-changer in how international power operates. So how does this soft war actually work? Well, it relies on two main mechanisms. First, panopticon effects. Basically, because you control the network, you see all the data. It's a massive information advantage. Second, choke point effects. This is where you literally flip a switch and cut off a state's access to global finance. This completely shifts conflict from, normal diplomatic pressure into forced economic isolation. And researchers point out this acts as a form of infrastructural violence. By blocking essential imports, the domestic economy is strangled. The financial network itself becomes the weapon. Let's move to Section 3, the roots of oil imperialism, and see how this builds on a much older blueprint. If we zoom out and trace this back, the struggle over the Middle East has always fundamentally been about controlling one key resource: oil. Look at the 19th century. Unequal treaties literally forced economic penetration into Iran under Qajar rule. Then jump to 1953. Historical records openly show the US and UK overthrowing Iran's democratically elected government just to protect Western oil interests, installing the Shah as a proxy. Then, 1979 hits. The Islamic Revolution explicitly rejects that Western proxy rule. Fast forward to 2018, the US exits the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and launches a maximum pressure economic campaign. The tactics might evolve, but that underlying battle for resource control, it remains remarkably consistent. This whole historical pattern is brilliantly explained by something called dependency theory. It's a sociological model showing how dominant industrialized states extract resources, like oil, from developing peripheral states. But here's the kicker. Historically, those dominant Western powers didn't actually want the Middle East to develop its own independent, industrialized economy. Actually, quite the opposite. They intentionally constrained that autonomous development to keep those nations reliant on Western markets and Western technology. Section 4. Neo-Colonialism and Economic Control. And this brilliantly illustrates how imperialism has evolved. Direct political control just isn't necessary anymore. Look at the methods. Old imperialism used military occupation and direct rule. Neo-colonialism, it uses financial conditionality and swift bans. Governance shifted from running formal colonies to relying on proxy elites or facing resistance from nations pivoting to new strategies. But the goal is practically identical. Old imperialism wanted resource extraction via brute force. Modern neo-colonialism wants market dependency via the weaponized interdependence we just talked about. If you control the bank accounts and the shipping lanes, you really don't need an occupying army. But listen, these sanctioned nations aren't just taking it lying down. They are actively pushing back against this neocolonial structure. Iran, for example, has leaned heavily into a look to the east strategy. They're building up domestic capabilities, which political scientists call inward balancing, and forming new multipolar alliances, like joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. It is a direct countermove to bypass Western financial choke points and find entirely new markets for their oil in Asia. Section 5. Masking hegemony with culture. So, how are these massive economic power grabs justified to the global public? Well, consider this famous quote from Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. He wrote, "The fundamental source of conflict in this new world will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The dominating source of conflict will be cultural." Now, according to critical sociological research, theories exactly like this are incredibly useful for dominant powers. Because think about it, they successfully shift our focus completely away from resource extraction and economic warfare. And instead, they fabricate this narrative of an inevitable cultural war. This ideological shift relies on a really dense concept scholars call neo-racism. After World War II, old-school biological racism was thankfully widely discredited. It became politically unacceptable, so the rhetoric had to modernize. Neo-racism, or cultural racism, abandons biological hierarchies. Instead, it claims that different cultures, say Western culture versus Islamic culture, are just fundamentally, inherently incompatible. It frames them as a natural threat to one another. It's a modernized way for the new right to divide people and maintain hegemony without sounding like a 19th century imperialist. Let's break down exactly how this cultural rhetoric acts as a mask for raw power. First, it completely replaces the debate over capital, labor, and resources with identity politics. It claims that values like democracy and human rights are uniquely Western, which casts other civilizations like Islamic or Confucian societies not as economic competitors but as inherent civilizational threats. And crucially, framing the conflict this way absolutely prepares public opinion for military interventions in places like the Middle East. If the public truly believes they're fighting a defensive war for the survival of their culture, they are way less likely to notice the actual primary motives operating in the background, the pursuit of raw materials, oil, and strategic global expansion. Which leaves us with this final, absolutely vital question to think about. Are today's geopolitical conflicts truly about clash in cultural values, or are they simply the latest iteration of a centuries-old struggle for global resources and economic control? The next time you see a headline about an oil tanker seized on the high seas or a new digital sanction being rolled out, I want you to remember the deeper historical and economic currents we've explored today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, keep looking beyond the surface narratives, and I'll catch you next time.